Ok, boa noite a todos. Estamos algumas pessoas já na sala. Welcome. Vamos começar este ano com mais um webinar Ibero-American Beer Cup. Ok? Só explicar um bocadinho o que é que vai ser a Ibero-American Beer Cup, ok? Em Portugal, e esperemos que seja este ano. É um concurso de cervejas que devia ter começado o ano passado, mas devido a estas contingências da pandemia não podemos começar e adiamos um ano. Esperemos que no fim deste ano, com data ainda a marcar, e como se portar as coisas até junho, julho mais ou menos, como as coisas forem andando de pandemia, poderemos marcar uma data. Okay? A Ibero-American Cup é um concurso internacional de cervejas, ok? Vamos fazer a ponte com a América do Sul, vários países da América do Sul em cervejas. Vamos juntar também a Península Ibérica. Não estamos limitados só a estes países, esperemos e tenho consciência disso, vamos ter outros países da Europa e mesmo do Canadá e dos Estados Unidos cervejas a virem a concurso. Bom, o facto destes webinars é para dar a conhecer a Ibero-American Beer Cup, ok? A todas as pessoas, para que as pessoas vão se acostumando ao conceito e ao evento que será no futuro, ok? Eu tenho a ajuda neste projeto do Bruno Aquino, que está aqui comigo hoje, esta noite, para apresentar o Ron, okay? Que nos dará hoje um webinar, uma apresentação sobre Scott Beers, ou cervejas escocesas. Okay? Bruno, se quiseres dizer alguma coisa, é tudo teu.
Sim, obrigado, Lucio. Boa noite. Boa noite a todos que nos estão a ouvir e boa noite ao Ron e obrigado ao Ron por estar aqui connosco. Eu vou fazer a apresentação em inglês também por cordialidade para com o Ron. Espero que me percebam. So everyone in the world knows Ron Pattison, but here's a little presentation. Ron is a beer historian, travel writer. He has a fantastic blog, if you don't know it, called birth.com. And he has published dozens of books about beer, and especially beer history. You can find it, of course, for instance, in Amazon. There are dozens of great beer books that I really recommend you to read. He will give us a depth view historical research into beer that is unrivaled. He has traveled through beer records, bring textbooks, newspapers, archives, and they have assembled a huge information about more than 20,000 years of course beer styles, some of them that have almost disappeared. Talking with Ron will bring us a totally different view of the origins of beer styles, maybe, like the origins of porter, the origins of IPA, but today especially about the Scottish styles. That will be the main focus of this presentation. So without delays, let's Ron do this magic, and in the end you can ask the master a few questions. So Ron, please tell us the brutal truth about Scottish beer, please.
Okay, let me only add one more thing. I hope this is not the one webinar from Ron. I hope they come again and give another webinar for another team, okay?
or be with us here in Portugal. That will be even greater, if possible.
Yeah, so that would be fun.
That's one.
So Ronnie, please.
Be fun. Okay, just 1 minute, please. Ron, that is all yours. Okay. Good night, Ron.
Okay, so the start of my okay. Yes, the start of my talk about Scottish beer. So I hope this is going to be informative and it's going to maybe change your minds a little bit about what Scottish beer is and what Scottish beer was.
We don't have in the presentation. Okay. I pass the presentation now. Just 1 minute, please.
Okay, well, I'm glad you can see it. The lovely map that I've got there in the background, which is showing this one area of Edinburgh that was virtually all breweries at one point. So I've got in the background there. Anyway, what I've already told you about me, so it's crazy beers can spend ridiculous numbers of hours going through all the records. Yeah, I'm not sure why, other than my own interest. Scottish beer. I got really fascinated by Scottish beer when I realised that most of what had been written about it didn't look very believable, didn't fit in with what I knew about Scottish beer. And so I found out there was this massive archive in Glasgow where lots of brewing records. I started photographing stuff and all this isn't it? And I came with a book, which is easily written about Scottish beer, but it's definitely a lot of people know things about beer. It's been quite different from the others. This is a book that covered them by my basically presentation is condensed versions of the book a really big quite long period that if you to Scottish beer, try it's pretty useful, but if you're not interested, well, maybe not quite so useful. Okay, I'm going to divide this in a couple of sections. The first one, I'm going to go through the ingredients, go through the processes, we look at this a bit more detail. It's very important when it comes to malt. In the 19th century and in the 20th century. So it's written when they and the other bit is remarkably rare. And we'll get into that. Yeah, the whole thing about he did in the high of coal. There's no way that he's not because for Phil. Really best. Very job unlike in England, where it's quite dull. Recipe to be honest, it's just oh, it's a really hot growing country, Scotland. They never really grew it very many but just because they grow hot there doesn't mean they lose them. I mean, most of England they grow hops. The hot growing regions are limited in England. It's a bit of southeast and the Midlands, and that's it. So so it wasn't unusual not to have hops to be very local to you. And after 1850, UK couldn't grow enough hops to the anyway. And so they were having huge amounts of hops in the world. And that was using for hop, just as true of English breweries as it was of Scottish ones. So it's, yeah, it was just because they didn't grow hops, you can't say, oh, well, they're not going to use very many hops. They don't grow hops around Burton-on-Trent, but they still use loads of hops there in all the IPAs. Sugar. For the first part of the 19th century, there was really something like a Reinheitsgebot in England, or in the UK. So you could only use malt, hops, water, and yeast, and that was it. And in 1847, they allowed sugar as well, but it wasn't really used very much initially. And it's only after they changed the tax laws in 1880 that they really started using sugar to any large amount. The Scots, yeah, they used a fair amount of sugar, mostly invert sugar, but some other ones as well. And then in the 20th century, then lactose gets quite popular. And so you see people using it in milk stouts, but in other beers as well. So you'll see lactose turning up in Scotch ale, mild ale as well. So beers you wouldn't necessarily associate with lactose. So before 1880, you couldn't use anything that wasn't malted. Then the law was changed. And so then you get people using a lot of maize, really. A bit of rice, but mostly maize. And then during wartime, when they couldn't get hold of the maize, but they didn't want to malt all the barley, then they were using flake barley. But mostly flake maize was the most popular adjunct, other than one brewery in Edinburgh, William Younger, who always used grits, and in some cases ridiculous amounts. So they had some beers which were 45% grits, 55% malt. So really massive adjunct content in them. But that's quite unusual. Normally the usage is much less than that. Edinburgh brewers were quite lucky that they had reasonably good water, especially reasonably good water for brewing pale ales, which is one of the reasons they got into the pale ale brewing business quite early on, and why they were quite successful in exporting pale ales and IPAs all around the world. For those who are interested, there's some lovely numbers here showing analyses of various waters, including some from Burton-on-Trent, one from Edinburgh, one from London, and one from, I don't know why it's Munich and Dublin together there, unless they're exactly the same. Anyway, so you can see the Edinburgh water's got quite a lot of minerals in it, not as much as the crazy Burton-on-Trent ones, but still quite a lot of minerals. Yeast. British brewers were a bit weird with yeast. They weren't very keen on single strain yeasts, mostly because they had problems with them when they first tried using them. The problem being that it wouldn't do the secondary conditioning, and they didn't realize that that was Brettanomyces that was doing it. And so when they went over to a single pitching yeast, a single strain, then they often found that the secondary conditioning wouldn't work properly. So they abandoned it and stuck with their multiple strains. And in fact, some UK breweries still use multiple strains. Adnams is a good example. They have two strains, that's two different yeasts in their pitching yeast. In Scotland, it's particularly weird that the Edinburgh brewers all used each other's yeasts. So I've got some brewing records from William Younger's where there's page after page where they're using every other yeast from every other brewery in Edinburgh apart from their own. So what I reckon probably happened is, and you see other breweries doing it as well, using other brewers' yeast, is that they probably didn't have any proprietary yeast at all. And it was just some mixed common strain that they ended up with because they were swapping it around so much. But it's really unusual. You see it occasionally in English breweries that they'll use another brewer's yeast, but not just as a regular practice as they seem to have done in Scotland. So it's one of the differences between English and Scottish brewing. They could do it in Edinburgh because they had lots of breweries physically really close to each other. So it was quite easy to just move the yeast from one to the other. Whereas in England, you didn't normally have such big concentrations of breweries in one spot. The Scots, hang on, just going to, my throat getting a little dry. Right, the Scots basically invented the modern form of infusion mashing. So if you see the system and the system that the English brewers were using right through to quite late in the 19th century was multiple mashers. So the typical one for porter is that you'd have 4 different mashers at different temperatures, and no sparges at all. And the Scots came up with the idea early in the 19th century of just having an infusion mash and then maybe 1 or 2 sparges, basically because this is going to take a lot of energy. I know from people who've tried doing the old porter mashers, the really complicated ones with 4 different mashers at different temperatures, said that they've had the best efficiency that they've ever had. So I'm assuming that's why porter breweries were doing that. It was mostly efficiency. They were trying to get everything out of the malt. And this is at a time when the malt was taxed. So you wanted to get as much extract as you possibly could out of the grain because that was going to save you tax money. And so the London brewers were obsessed with that. The Scottish brewers seem to have taken a different tactic and seem to have been more interested in saving energy. And so they had a much simpler mashing schemes. And yeah, basically just the one. Everything was mashed at the same temperature, no differences. Whereas a London brewer might have a different mash for their ales compared to the one that was for their porter and their stout. And so here's an example on the left. It's William Younger, that's one of the big Edinburgh breweries, and Barclay Perkins, that's one of the big London breweries. And you see the difference in the mashing scheme. So basically, you've just got a single infusion and then 2 sparges at Younger's, whereas at Barclay Perkins, you've got 3 mashes and then a sparge. And so it's much more complicated, and the overall time it took for the Barclay Perkins one was much longer because they were mashing rather than just sparging. So it's a more complicated, a lengthier process, and one that's going to be using more energy in the form of coal. Now here you go to the 20th century, and you can see that at William Younger's, this is the 1930s, that basically they're mashing the same way as they had done almost a century earlier. So still just a single infusion mash with 2 sparges. And this is Adnams. I mean, they're still going Adnams. This is a relatively small country brewery. And you can see that they're doing what I would say was a typical 19th century English mashing scheme, which is where you have an initial infusion mash, then you have an underlet. So that's a small amount of water at a higher temperature, which is let in through the bottom of the mash. And then the rakes go around a couple of times to mix it in the mash. So it's effectively a form of step mash. So you're raising the temperature by maybe 3 or 4 degrees. So again, this is something about efficiency. So you're trying to get the most efficient use of the enzymes properly, so you're going to get the biggest extract from the malt. And then they had 3 sparges after that. So a bit more complicated than the scheme in Scotland. One of the things I've had the most arguments about with home brewers is party guiling, because people have got completely the wrong idea about it. So it's not having 3 worts, each one making a different beer. It's more complicated than that. It's about having 3 separate worts, or maybe 4 or sometimes 2, boiling them separately with their own hops, then after the boil, blending them to get the gravities that you wanted. So you might, if you've got 3 worts, you might make 4 different beers out of them, each one of them having some of each of the 3 worts. So it's quite a complex and quite an efficient way of brewing. When you get to the 20th century, most Scottish brewers party-guiled everything. They didn't brew anything single guile, so just a beer by itself. So most of their beers would be pale ales. So they have 3 strengths of pale ales, and they party-guile those together in various combinations. They probably have a strong ale as well. They party-guile that with the other ones, and then they might have a stout, and then they'd somehow party-guile that with the other pale ale as well. So they were doing. They're basically. 20th century Scottish brewing is mostly fairly dull because the brewers just have the one recipe that they use for all their beers. They're all basically just different strength versions of the same thing, no matter what they might have been marketed as. So it's really not very interesting, and way less interesting than it appears on the surface. If you just look at the brands and the labels for beers, you'd think there were far more different beers being brewed than there actually were. One of the things people say about Scottish beer is that it was, the idea is that you boil it for hours and hours and hours and turn it into goo. That's where you get all the colour from. I found no evidence of that. In fact, one of the really strange things is that in the early 19th century, Scottish beers had incredibly short boil times. So sometimes 60 minutes or even less, even for the really strong beers. And that's very short. No, you don't see any boils under about an hour and a half, and often got 2 or 3 hour boils in England. So the Scottish boil times in the beginning of the 19th century were unusually short, I would say. And over time, they move up and down all over the place. And sometimes they're longer than in England, sometimes shorter. You can't say one specific thing about it. It's different periods, different things. And I've got a table here that shows it. So you can see these are the boil times in hours over a different period. So you can see at the start it's quite short. In the 1890s, quite high at 3 hours. Then it goes back down again. Whereas Whitbread, which is so William Youngle on the left, that's a large Edinburgh brewery in Scotland, and on the right it's Whitbread, which is a big London brewery, where you can see the boil times are more consistent. But you can't just say, oh, simply that they boil the beer for longer in Scotland. It's not that simple. It's as things always are. It's much more complex. And this is later on, and here you can see, well, they're pretty much the same between Usher, which is a Scottish brewery, and Whitbread, which is a London brewery. You can see it's around an hour and a half most of the time, something like that. So no real difference. The normal story told is that Scottish beer was fermented almost like at lager-like temperatures, really long and slow and quite cold. One of the great things about a lot of the Scottish brewing records is they have a full fermentation record. So you can see what the temperature was all the way through the fermentation. And this is not what happened. People can possibly be confused by the pitching temperatures. So they would often pitch some Scottish beers would pitch quite cold. So what I would say would be a normal temperature I would expect in Fahrenheit, this is, I can't remember what it is in centigrade, is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of the Scottish beers were pitched a good bit colder than that. But the reason was because they were really strong. And so they were going to generate more heat during the fermentation. So people would pitch them colder. So generally, the stronger the beer, the lower the pitching temperature. So a weak beer pitched several degrees higher than a strong beer. And so that could make it look a bit different. But here I've got a nice graph. And so this is, again, William Younger. And this is showing the fermentation profile. And so you can see they start off around 60 or a little bit cooler. I think this is about 16 or 17 centigrade. And you can see the temperature goes up. They just let the temperature rise during the first bit of the fermentation, and then the temperature goes down. And that's because they're controlling the temperature of the wort in the fermenting vessel by using a temperator. So they'll switch them on after a couple of days and get the temperature to come down again. So it's not. So you see that the temperature it covers quite a range. It is not cool, and it looks very much like this is from Fuller's. Something very similar. The temperature goes up in the first part of it, steadies off, and then goes down, and ends up at the same temperature that it started. So the different types of beer at the bottom, but you can see it's roughly similar for all of them. Some things like Scotch ale, it's a dark beer, and people associate a dark colour with it. But what you find if you actually look at the strong ales that were used, that were brewed in the 20th century, then there's no dark malts in them at all, or maybe some crystal malt, and that'll be about it. Mostly they're all pale malt, and the colouring all comes from caramel. So they were crazy about colouring with caramel, Scottish brewers, and they would colour up the same beer a different colour for when it was going to be sold in a different town. Just ridiculous combinations, some of them. Truly crazy. When you look at some of the documents, it's just thinking, why the hell were they doing this? So the same beer could be anything from, almost lager-like colour through to black. It'd be the same beer. They'd have just depended on whether they put any caramel in or whether they put a load of caramel in. It could be virtually any colour in between. So just really weird. English brewers have been known to colour up beers with caramel, but not quite the same way that the Scots did. And it was a really strange thing about Scotch beer, and it makes it hard when I'm trying to work out what colour they were looking at the brewing record, because it doesn't tell you, because the colouring came in after it had been brewed. So if you just look at the records, all these beers look pale, even though you know that they were dark. It's quite frustrating sometimes. So this is a run through the beer styles. What I would say with the styles brewed in Scotland. So you've got one, Shilling ales, which is really specific to Scotland. The others, mostly they're the same as the styles that you'd find elsewhere. But as we go through here, I'll explain how, even though they might have the same names, they're not exactly the same. And so you can't just say, oh, Scottish beer is distinct from English beer. It's not like they're exactly the same. And they go through a different sort of path. So in a way, Scotland is going through the beer styles quicker than in England, which you can see by the way that lager became really popular in Scotland earlier than it did in England. And in that sense, they were ahead of the game in the progression of beer styles. So Shilling ales, these are the things that are normally just called by the number of shillings they cost per hogshead. So 54-gallon barrel, the wholesale price, that's how they basically said what the quality of the beer was, how strong it was, by how much you're going to sell it for. So obviously, the more expensive the beer, the stronger it was. These were really the equivalent of English mild ales, and most of them were sold young. It was quite weird what they did in Scotland. It was quite unlike the English practice, where everything was draft. In Scotland, most of these beers, they were straight after primary fermentation. They'd be wrapped into hogsheads, so these 54-gallon barrels. Then they'd be sent out to pubs and to third parties who would bottle them, and then they just let them get into condition naturally, and then they'd be sold and drunk. So even though they were often really quite strong beers, they were all basically being sold as mild ales. So the stronger ones might have been over 11% alcohol. And normally in England, a beer that strong mostly would have been aged a little bit, but these were all aged for virtually no period of time at all. Mostly pretty lightly hopped. What could make things confusing is that now these ones are a specific type. These are the original sort of Scottish ales, Scottish mild ales. When you get the English styles coming in, like porter and stout, you'll get the shilling designations being used for them as well. So you might have a 60 shilling ale, and you might have a 60 shilling stout, and you might have a 60 shilling pale ale. again, all it's telling you is the relative strength of the beer, the shilling designation. It's not really telling you what the style is. These beers, you don't really see them after World War One, other than sometimes William Younger brewed one, a 200 shilling ale, a couple of times in the 1930s, but I haven't seen one from any other brewery after World War One. Here's some examples from, again, William Younger from the 1840s, and you can see there's a whole range of strength from 42 to 160 shilling, and loads of really very strong ones. Most of them, the middle range are hopped really lightly at 3 to 4 pounds a quarter. That's not very much. That's way less than an English mild ale. And the 160 shilling at 13 pounds a barrel a quarter, sorry, that's quite a decent hopping rate. That's not quite. That's about half what an IPA would have been, but IPAs had stupid amounts of hops in them. And you can see there's some pretty strong beers in here, but often pretty poor rates of attenuation. So the final gravities given here probably aren't the real final gravities, which almost certainly would have been lower, because this is just this. I don't think this is even the racking gravity. So you have to assume that they were actually more fermented out than that when they were sold. Table beer. Table beer pretty much died out in England when they changed the tax system in 1830, because before that it had had its own class and it was taxed at a lower rate. In Scotland, they kept on brewing it and seemed to have quite a name for it, because you find it not just on sale in Scotland. I've seen adverts for it in England, so they were selling this stuff. For the time, these were beers of 3 or 4% alcohol. That was incredibly weak. So in the middle of the 19th century, virtually no English beer was under 5% alcohol. Ordinary mild would have been about 6% mostly. So 3 or 4% was incredibly weak. Presumably to compensate for that, these were really heavily hopped. So 16 pounds a quarter, that's like a pale ale. So really quite a lot. And again, this is something that died out around World War One, as did a lot of things. And these are some examples from William Younger again, showing beers that are, yeah, a lot of hops, but not a huge amount of alcohol. So really, and this is the stuff that literally in the 19th century they gave to the children, because they didn't really think it was alcoholic, at just 2 or 3%. Pale ale. This pale ale was really important in the development of Scottish brewing, because it's when they first really got big export markets outside the UK, and they were very quick to pick up on the whole pale ale trade. And after the Burton brewers in Edinburgh and in Alloa, a small town north of Edinburgh, they became some of the biggest exporters, other than the people know from Burton, which was Bath and Allsop. So they got a big export trade, and at some points in the 19th century, they were the Scots. Well, I think towards the end of it, they're responsible for about 25% of UK exports, even though Scotland only had about 10% of the UK population. And eventually up to 50% of exports came from Scotland, beer exports. Again, for just 10% of the population. So they were completely overrepresented in exports. And pale ale was one of the beers that had got them into a lot of markets out in the Far East. And pale ale came to be the beer of Scotland. And so the modern styles that people know, 60, 70 and 80 shilling, they're all types of pale ale. And they all have their origins in the beers in the 1850s that you start seeing being introduced in Scotland, and which eventually evolve into something completely different. So you start off with something that's a really dry, hoppy beer, and you end up with something that's quite malty and not very hoppy at all. And that's just what happens over a long period of time. and we can start to see this happening. So the first one's XP, that was actually billed as an IPA. The difference between IPA and Pale Ale is completely indistinct in 19th century Britain, and terms weren't used consistently. The only way you can differentiate the one from the other is what the brewery called it, because otherwise it's completely random. And one of the most famous IPAs that was ever brewed, Bass, was never called IPA. It was always officially called just Pale Ale. So it's really very complicated. So most of these beers initially, you see here, these would have been called IPA. Or maybe Pale Ale, who knows. Anyway, so you can see beers that are quite well attenuated. The hopping rates from the 1850s ones at 20 odd pounds of hops a quarter, that's about the rate that they'd be using in Burton. So that's really, really a lot of hops, especially for a beer of a relatively modest strength. This is another thing you might notice, that 19th century IPA wasn't particularly strong all the time. And it was often, especially if you think this XP here, an OG of 1055, that's weaker. That's lower than the weakest sort of mild. So this is not only isn't a strong beer, it's actually one of the weakest beers they were producing was the IPA. But okay. So after World War One, Scotland becomes dead boring. Basically, people just brew different strengths of pale ale from the same recipe. Really, really dull. Yeah. You gradually start to see the terms 60, 70, and 80 shilling evolve for the three different strengths of pale ales. So what you'd call after World War II, 60 shilling is light, 70 shilling heavy, 80 shilling export. So breweries brewed these same, different strength versions of the same beer, coloured them up with caramel and stuff just to make them look however people expected them to look. I mean, I used to think that 60 shilling was the equivalent of mild. I didn't realise it was just exactly the same as 70 shilling, just a bit weaker and some caramel in it. So I was very disillusioned when I found that out. And when you start getting to after World War II or even before World War II, they're very lightly hopped and much more lightly hopped than their English equivalents. So this is Robert Younger. This is another Edinburgh brewery, a smaller one than William Younger. And you can see they haven't just got 60, 70, and 80. They've also got an even weaker 54 shilling beer. And at this point, probably virtually all they brewed have been the 60 shilling, mostly 60 and 70 shilling, and very little of the 80 shilling or the export. And the hopping rate at about £5 per quarter, that's pretty light. That's lower than an English mild ale. So they're very strange sort of pale ales. They're not really very bitter anymore, mostly malt orientated, not that brilliantly attenuated, so fairly sweetish beers. The only difference I can see between what they called shilling ales and actual mild ales in the 19th century is how they were going to be served. So I said before that the shilling ales were beers that were sent out in hogsheads and then bottled. The difference seems to be with the ones that were called mild ale were sold as draft beers rather than being bottled. And so they came to be known as mild ale, and the shilling ales were still just called ales. You get ones that they use the X system a bit, or also the shilling system when mild ales. It's not that consistent in Scotland. But what you find is that pale ales start to really dominate in Scotland quite early, much more earlier than in England, where bitter is not the most popular style until after World War II. It's different in Scotland, and you see that towards the end of the 19th century, pale ales are really starting to push mild ale out. And then after World War I, which really disrupts everything, breweries drop a lot of beers during the war. and then after the war seem to have a rethink, and most of the breweries just don't brew mild anymore. And so, yeah, it's just all pale ales. One exception is William Younger, who do carry on brewing, if not just one, but 3 different mild ales. But I think the reason that they were doing that is that they had tied houses in England, and tied houses in England between the wars would have expected to have a mild. So that's probably why they were brewing it. And they might well not have sold it at all in Scotland. It might well have been completely just for the English market. And so that, yeah, Youngers persisted with it, but most of the others didn't. 60 shilling, that's what I used to think was Scottish mild. It certainly tasted like it to me. And it did sort of fill the mild slot, something around 3% alcohol and dark. So, yeah. Was it a pale ale? Was it a mild? Who can say? Sadly, they don't seem to exist anymore, 60 shillings. I don't know if anyone makes one anymore. Maclay's used to do a very nice one, which again, as I now know, was just, yeah, a pale ale with caramel in it. Because I've seen their brewing records. So these are the 3. I mean, amazingly, these 3 mild ales, X, 2X, and 3X, William Younger were brewing right up until the middle of World War II. So for almost 100 years after this. And you can see these early mild ales, they're very strong beers. They got really high gravities. And, well, the X not very well hot, but the 3X really quite heavily hopped. And of course, you can see that as time goes by, the gravities go down and the hopping rate goes down, which is pretty typical of what you see in Scottish beers. And this is a bit later, even lower gravities, and getting to be quite low hopping rates as well. And so by the time you get to 1913, even the 3X is only about 1065. So not that strong for the top level mild. Porter and stout. When I was searching through the newspaper archives, I came across this brilliant article from a Scottish newspaper in the 18th century, where someone was complaining about people buying English porter and accused them of throwing their money away on the other south of the border and urging Scots not to drink porter. And so what you see is that in the 18th century, Scotland didn't have a very developed brewing industry. It was way behind England, was on a small scale, wasn't very mechanized or industrialized. And you start having, after the Act of Union, so when England and Scotland become the same country, then you start getting this English beer coming into Scotland. And there's still a bit of resentment against the English at this point. And so it's seen as a big national thing to start brewing porter in Scotland, because this is the trendy beer style of the day. And so you see they start brewing porter quite early on in Scotland in the 18th century and sort of get quite into it. But what you see in the 20th century is when they started off brewing beers that were very similar to the ones in London, they start to really grow apart. And you get some weird ones in Scotland towards the end of the 19th century. So even before you have the milk stout developed, which isn't until 1911, you'd already got stouts in Scotland that must have been very sweet because they were very poorly attenuated and had very few hops, and in some cases no fresh hops at all, only ones that had already been used in another brew. So think beers that must have been sweet. So ones that could have done it without lactose. But once you find lactose comes in and you have milk stouts, then the Scots go pretty crazy about it and come up with some beers that are just ridiculously sweet. Hardly any alcohol in them, really, really strange. Even though you did have someone like William Younger, they continued to brew sort of a classic type of double brown stout. So that was quite interesting. Macleay's, they were the people who invented oatmeal stout, or oat malt stout as they called it. They tried to patent the name, to patent the idea. But what happened is all the other breweries, they said, okay, well, if you patented oat malt, we'll just use oatmeal. And so you had oatmeal stout instead. They never managed to really get any money out of it in the way that I think they'd hoped to. It's very different, the Macleay's beer, to most other ones, in that most oatmeal stouts that I've seen, they have like maybe 1% of the grist is oats, sometimes not even 1%. Whereas the Macleay's oat malt stout, that was 30% oat malt, so it really did have a high oat content in it, which wasn't true most oatmeal stouts. Mostly it's a complete joke. Then they put in enough so they could actually call it oatmeal stout. It's way too little to have any effect on the flavour. So these are some William Younger's porters and stouts from the 19th century. As you can see, this S3 from 1879. This is one of the ones I was on about that must have been quite sweet because it had no fresh hops in it, wasn't very well attenuated, pretty weak, and this sort of becomes the model for 20th century Scottish stouts in a way. DBS, that's a really interesting beer. That's sort of the beer that became Carlsberg Porter, because Carl Jacobsen, the son of the Carlsberg founder, did an apprenticeship at William Younger, and one of the beers he brewed while he was there was DBS, the William Younger Stout. And when he got back to his own brewery in Copenhagen, he brewed a beer called DBS, which is the beer that was sold as Carlsberg Porter. So it's a really weird link between Carlsberg and Edinburgh. And this is to show you. So this is interesting. You can see that originally this pale malt, brown malt, and black malt, that's a real typical London porter or stout grist. And the proportions, that really looks like a London beer. But you can see over time it changes. And so eventually they drop the brown malt. But this is quite light. Everyone starts off doing pale, brown, and black in the early 19th century. And what you see is in most of the country, people simplify the grist and they drop the brown malt. And it's always interesting to see when that happens. In London, they never drop the brown malt. But you can see here, it's like at the end of the 19th century that Younger dropped it, which is actually quite late. And then obviously then it just goes strange and get other stuff in. But they were brewing it quite authentically. They're actually atypical in this, William Younger. When I see other Scottish breweries, they didn't tend to stick with the brown malt. They tended to just go from the pale malt and black malt route. And these are the Younger stouts from a bit later. And you can see they're still brewing the old-fashioned one at quite a decent gravity, reasonable-ish amount of hopping. So by this point, very atypical of what was being brewed in Scotland and called stout, the DBS. It was probably the last stout that was brewed that way in Scotland. So what's more typical is these types of beers. So these are post-war stouts. Sweetheart stout, that still exists. Someone actually gave me a couple of cans of that not that long ago. It's incredibly sweet and not really alcoholic. So I mean, you can see these beers, none of these are intoxicating. The strongest is only just over 2% alcohol. Really terrible degree of attenuation. You didn't really get beers as extreme as this in England. You'd have sweet stouts, but not ones as crazy as this. I mean, some of these you could sell to children. They're 1.5% ABV. It's like shandy. So it's a weird type of beer, which seems to have been something that was specifically Scottish and which weirdly still lives on. Stock ale or old ale and mild ales, they're always the same thing. Ales, the style, stock or mild, that just tells you, or old, that just tells you how it's been aged before it's sold. And so stock ale's basically just a mild ale that's been stored and had a secondary conditioning before you sell it. But generally what you do, if you knew you were going to be aging something, then you'd hop it at a much higher rate. So normally at least 50% more hops than a mild ale, maybe even as much as double. But generally you throw more hops in. That was the thing. The longer you wanted something to keep, the more hops you put in it. So they're a bit like some of the stronger shilling ales. It's another thing though, it's a bit difficult to pin down. Is this just a strong shilling ale that they might have aged? Is this really a stock ale? You just have to go by things it says in the brewing record, like if they put an S there, that tells you it's a stock ale. But it can be difficult to tell. Again, like most of the Scottish styles, it died out about World War One, and the strong ales that you get after World War One are very different. So what people think of as the modern type of Scotch ale, it is quite different from these older stock ales. So here you see, yeah, you can see how I could tell these were stock ales just because the S is there. And so you can see that early ones are just crazily high strengths, not particularly high, crazy hopping rates, but reasonable. And yeah, this attenuation, because these were beers that were going to have a secondary conditioning, which means Brettanomyces, the real final gravities would have been way lower than that, because they'd have been stored for a year or two, and the Brettanomyces would have eaten away. So you'd expect them, by the time they were actually consumed, to be probably at least 75% attenuation, if not more. And here are some late stock ales, which aren't even particularly strong, and yeah, I'm not quite sure why. They're quite heavily hopped though for Scotland at the time. So yeah, not sure how long these would have been aged. Maybe a couple of months. Yeah, maybe 6 months or so, but probably not a really long length of time because they don't have the gravity for that. They're just too weak. Strong and Scotch ale. Yeah, the original beers that Scotland was famous for, if you look in the middle of the 19th century, was Edinburgh ale or Scotch ale, which are basically the stronger shilling ales. So things that were, yeah, maybe 9 or 10% alcohol. These were the beers that the first beers that the Scots exported, and Scotland came to be associated with these really strong beers. But it's quite odd that often Scotland had this big dichotomy when you get to the 20th century, where they had a lot of the beer was very weak or not very strong at all, but they were brewing some quite strong beers. And you have the ones in the 19th century, they were exported quite a bit. That one of the places was the West Indies, where they didn't take the IPA that they did in India, but in the West Indies they liked either strong stout, so like the Guinness export stout, or strong Scotch ale. So they had a big export market for this in the 19th century, and they continued to brew it. And what you see is that in the 20th century they shift their market, and then they start selling Scotch ale in Belgium, and then it spawns this whole new style in Belgium, which is quite interesting. Here's some of the ones from pre-World War One, and you can see the strongest William Younger one is a pretty strong beer. This is like Fast Number One, the original barley wine, and it's obviously meant to be because they're using the Burton style numbering system. So this is what they did. This is what Bastard and Burton, they had numbered ales. Number one was their barley wine, and you can see that William Younger were obviously emulating that in this set of beers. and number 1 was around for quite a long while, but number 3 for even longer. So I mean, I've drunk number 3, and it was back again a few years ago. About, I think in the last 10 years it's been around, but I think it's discontinued again. But so you got the 2 types in after World War I. One that's about 8% alcohol, and another one that's about 5.5%. So in terms of William Younger, that's number 1 and number 3. But the weaker one, it's only really William Younger that make that. And most other breweries, they got one that's about 8% alcohol. That's just party guiled with their other pale ale. So it's just a super strong pale ale. Quite a few of them get exported to Belgium. They colour it up. So they're brewed, they're pale, but they're coloured up with caramel mostly. William Younger, he had a few sort of darker malts in their ones, but most of the breweries where it was the same as the pale ale, they were just colouring it with caramel. Mostly bottled, but you did see some of the really strong ones on draft occasionally. Number 3, on the other hand, was mostly, well, not mostly, but about 50-50 drafted and bottled. I think the reason why you probably got quite a bit of it on draft was because Youngers had pubs in London. In London, one of the standard draft beers was the thing called Burton, which was a draft dark beer, about 5.5% alcohol. And so in their London pubs, number 3 filled the role of London Burton. And so I think that's why they brewed that beer, or at least that's why they had the draft version of it. Here's a collection of strong ales. So you can see most of them have got gravities in the 1080s, and they're sort of like 7-ish, 8-ish%, something like that. Quite a lot of variation in the hopping rate. But yeah, I mean, most of the beers had a fairly similar profile. I mean, some of them, I know that the Thomas Usher one was sold in Belgium, and I'm pretty sure the William Younger one was as well. Brown ale. Brown ale's a weird style. It came and went very quickly. So Mann's Brewery in London's the first one to have a brown ale, really a modern one. You had brown ales brewed in the 18th century, but when people went over to using pale malt as the base for pretty much every beer around the end of the 18th century, then brown ale just completely disappeared. So for around 100 years, you didn't really have anything called brown ale in Britain. Then Mann's started using the name around 1900, and you had this new style that appeared. Didn't do much before World War I, but then became incredibly popular in the 1920s and 1930s, probably due to the rise of bottled beer. So you had a big surge in bottled beer between the wars. So I think by the end of the 1930s was about 30% of sales were bottled beer. And that's not people buying bottles at home, that's people buying bottled beer in the pub. And so brown ale profited from this. It's partly because people didn't trust draft beer. Often it wouldn't be in very good condition. So if you bought a bottled beer, then you knew that it should be the same as it had been when it left the brewery. And so what you find is that what most breweries do is they just bottle their mild and call it brown ale. They might prime it a bit differently, but it's basically their dark mild that they've stuck in a bottle. And so you very rarely see anything in a bottle called mild. So for me, it's really frustrating. Looking in brewing records, you very rarely come across anything that's a brown ale, because most breweries didn't brew a brown ale. They just bottled something as brown ale, another beer. There are some exceptions to this. But what you find is there are a couple of different types that evolved. So you'd have the normal brown ale, which wouldn't be particularly strong. I mean, the initial ones would be about average strength, but what you find after World War II is that they're down to about 3% alcohol. But you also had the stronger type, which is like Newcastle Brown Ale. And you find quite a few Scottish breweries brewed a brown ale like that. The reason probably being that a lot of them had the trade and sold a lot of beer in the Northeast. And so they'd have been making a brown ale for that specific market, which expected a brown ale to be 4.5% alcohol rather than 3.2%, which is what people expected in most of the rest of Britain. And so here you can see these are ones between the wars, and you can see that there's the Bernard one is a weak version, but you can see most of the other ones are relatively strong. And then you got the colder one sort of in the middle. But these stronger ones, I would very much suspect that the ones 1050 and above, that they were all meant for around Newcastle in England. And these are post-war ones, and you can see that there's, again, a mixture, some quite weak ones, and then some other ones that are actually very strong for a post-World War II beer. So, again, I reckon some of these weren't intended for the Scottish market, but for the northeast of England. Scotland has a long history of lager brewing. One of the weirdest things I ever came across was when I was reading a history of the Spaten Brewery in Munich, and they had some stuff about Sedlmeyer's tour around the UK with Andrea, and it had this bit about how he'd been in Edinburgh and got to know this brewer there, and then had sent him some yeast. And so how this guy with this small brewery in Edinburgh had been brewing lager in Britain or in Scotland in the 1840s, which put back lager brewing in England in the UK by several decades. Until then, people thought the normal story had been it hadn't started until the 1860s. So this was a very early date. Unfortunately, he couldn't propagate the yeast for very long, and so he abandoned it, Muir. But again, the Scots brewers were really quick to get in on lager brewing. The big event that spread lager around the world was the 1868 Paris exhibition, where Anton Dreher had a stand, and his beer was a massive hit. And so what you have after that is lager spreads around Europe quite quickly, mostly originally in the form of Dreher's type of lager. And what you see is that some of the Scottish brewers, they pick up on it really quickly. So William Younger in 1879 starts brewing a Pilsner. I think, again, the reason why they were doing this was the link with Carlsberg, because they were using Carlsberg's yeast. And so they did a little bit of Pilsner brewing, but just on the normal plant, and they gave it up after a while. Then you find Tennent's, they build a proper lager brewery, and they start brewing on a fairly serious scale. One of the reasons the Scottish breweries were so keen to get in on lager brewing was because, as I've already mentioned, they were big exporters. And what you find towards the end of the 19th century is there's a big shift in people's tastes in the Far East. And so they go from wanting to drink things like pale ale to wanting to drink lager. And so the Scottish brewers, because they got important markets in the Far East, they wanted to brew lager because they wanted to be able to compete with the European breweries, the continental breweries. And so that's why you see them making a big effort to brew lager. And so in between the wars, there's only a handful of breweries in the UK brewing lager, and more than half of them are in Scotland. And that's the reason why they were very keen on making sure that they could keep some export markets. And so these are really early William Younger Pilsners, which are quite strong, really lightly hopped, actually. Yeah, not really much I can say about those, but probably stronger, some of them, than you'd expect a Pilsner to be. And these are some lagers from between the wars. Yeah, when British brewed lager was reasonably strong. So these are all from different breweries, and this is in fact quite a large percentage of the lager beers that were being brewed at the time, and most of them in Scotland. Graham Golden's Golden Lager is a good one, because when we go to the next one, you'll see what that became. You can see it down here. So it became Skoll at a certain point. So that was originally Graham's Golden Lager, a beer that comes from Scotland originally, from the Alloa Brewery. So you can see here by this point, the lagers have all got fairly weak. So they're, just 3 and a bit % alcohol. So not really like continental lagers anymore. And let's have a look. Okay, so that's me gone through everything now. This is the book. If you want to know even more ridiculous detail, I go into truly unbelievable detail in the book. But if you're interested in Scottish beer and learning more about it, I think it's a good thing to look at. I'm certainly quite pleased with it, and I think it gives a good overview of the development of Scottish beer over the last couple of 100 years, and some idea about what it might have tasted like. Just so you know, this is my blog, and if you want to buy any of my books, there's a link here. I've got loads of them, all about various aspects, mostly British beer history, but some stuff on German as well. So yeah, if you want to, feel free to buy some books from me, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Ron, for your presentation. It was fantastic. I don't know if Lucio is seeing what's happening at YouTube. But
no, we have some problem the transmission, okay, but I resolve then middle in the middle way, okay. In this moment we don't have any question.
Well, I will ask Ron, because there were so many things interesting in what he was saying. So Ron, at one point you said that they colored the beer, and there was a practice of like 170 beer combinations. So why have you understood that practice really?
I don't know. They just seem to have got into the habit of, say, I think it was Aberdeen, where they just sent the beer really dark, and then other ones different.
Do you think it was the consumer that asked that, or if it was just like the brewers having fun with the process?
No, I think it seems to have been that people in different places expected the beer to be a different colour. I don't know why that was. It's bizarre.
That's very strange. Really.
You have it a bit in England. What you'll have is, it's like with say Timothy Taylor's. They have 2 milds. They have a pale mild and they have a dark mild. They're the same beer, just with caramel and then a dark mild. Yeah. British brewers do that a little bit, but nothing like the way they did in Scotland. So they might have a pale beer that they made dark with caramel, but they wouldn't have a pale beer that they make 10 different colours. That's a particularly weird Scottish trait.
Yes. At one point, I was thinking that one of the main differences between the north and the south of the border, as we were explaining, was the attenuation. Scottish beers, on average, seem very well less attenuated than English beers. So, as you have said, many might taste sweeter and show more caramel malt notes. Was it also a request by the consumers? Do you think so?
I don't think so much a request. I think people just, you're just going to brew the beers that the market demands. And so it's like the thing with the sweet stouts, which is completely unlike anywhere else. That really, really extreme beers. And that you only have that in Scotland. And it must have been a demand for those beers. Someone must have been drinking them. And you see that loads of breweries start making them. So obviously, someone made a beer like that. They sold loads of it, and other people imitated it.
Yeah,
I think this is the way it used to work. You see, someone has a beer that's a bit different from everyone else's. It starts selling really well. Well, everyone else is going to want to get in on the act. They're going to want to have, take advantage of that trend. You see it today. I mean, it's exactly what breweries still do. If you want to sell beer, if that's your primary aim, you're going to brew the type of beer that people want to drink. And this is why you see that Scottish beer starts diverging really significantly in the late 19th century. And so you see that when World War One breaks out, Scottish beer is on average about 0.5% ABV weaker than English beer. There's actually quite a difference, and not just and the reason it isn't more. In fact, most of the bulk of the beer that's being brewed in Scotland is even weaker than that. It's just that they're also brewing quite a bit of really strong beer that balances it out more. But the beer that most people are drinking is probably 1% ABV weaker than in London.
Yeah, but after the World War II, I think that in England you started to see a recovery in the ABV, where in the Scottish beers things seem to tended to keep following the wartime. Don't you think so?
I'd have to look it up now. I think it's sort of stabilised, but yeah, that's what you find is it's stabilised everywhere. So I mean, an average in the UK, when you get back to, I think gets back up to 1037 average gravity, so about 3.7% ABV, around 1950, and then it stays at that level for the next 30 years. It's incredibly stable. The average strength of beer. I mean, it's one of the things I didn't realise when I first started investigating beer history, that the period that I was sort of at the end of, so like in the mid-70s, so basically the 30 years of the post-war period, I didn't realise they'd been 30 of the most stable years in terms of British beer in the whole of its history, that very little had happened. The beer had actually stayed really very similar, had changed much in strength. There have been huge changes in the styles, maybe which styles were popular, but nothing was really happening. You'd really just got a development of what had happened pre-war, and yeah, the strengths changed a little bit from what they were before World War II, but otherwise not very much. It was, yeah, actually a period of unusual stability, and of course you don't realise that. So I look back. This is why a lot of people from my generation, they thought British beer had been the way it was forever, because it had been like that for as long as most people could remember. So you'd think that this would go back even further, whereas obviously it didn't. And obviously there've been loads of changes in beer. It's just that you had virtually no one around that experienced any of those changes.
Yeah. So when I was reading one of your books, I remember you saying that contrary to what happens in England, much of the pubs in Scotland were not typically owned by the brewers themselves. Why do you think that happened?
Yeah, that's a really complicated one. I think it was partly to do with the slightly different licensing laws in Scotland, where they really didn't like multiple ownership of licenses. So, but they did have tiny estates, but not as big ones. But the thing was that they didn't physically own the pubs, but that doesn't mean they didn't control the pubs.
Okay.
And so what the typical thing that you had in Scotland was a loan tie. So a brewery would lend money to a publican. I don't know, presumably to, I don't know, make the pub nicer or whatever. Often, in fact, what the publican would just do is just take this money, not do anything with it. He wouldn't really have to pay it back. He'd just have to take the beer from the brewery. And then if he got a better offer from another brewery, what would happen is that brewery would lend him the money he owed to the other one. He'd pay off that brewery and then start taking beer from the new brewery. So it was a slightly different system. So even though the breweries owned relatively small numbers of pubs. In fact, they controlled the trade of many, many more. I mean, a lot of what were free houses, supposedly free houses around where I lived, were actually tied to Scottish and Newcastle, one of the Scottish breweries.
Yeah. The big ones, of course.
They didn't own them. They just lent them money or put in cellar equipment or something like that. And so they took maybe not everything from them, but certainly most of their draft beer they took from them. So yeah, and that's how it worked in Scotland. They just had loan ties. It's how it works here. How it works in lots of countries. That they the brewery doesn't own the premises, but they control the beer supply through some sort of agreement with whoever does actually own the premises. So you get it all over the place. It was just more open in the UK that everyone knew where they stood, whereas in lots of cases it doesn't look like the breweries until this stuff really does.
Okay. So you were talking about Scottish beer styles, and we were talking about, of course, the chilling ales, and you said that they died around around World War One, I think.
Yeah.
So why do you think evolution of consumer tastes, people drinking more pale ales or something like that?
Well, what you tend to find is that most world wars, they just accelerated trends that were already going on. So what you see in Scotland is that the chilling ales had been losing popularity. So they were becoming not really key parts of breweries' ranges anymore. And what happens in the war is that, you can't produce as much beer, and what breweries tend to do is concentrate on their key products and drop all the marginal ones. What happens during the war is that the Scottish breweries really cut down the range of beers they brew and basically stopped brewing things like chilling ales, especially because some of them were quite strong beers, which you couldn't brew during the war. And then they just went back after the war because they're not important enough products. So you see some other beers, like some beers get discontinued during World War One, but because there's still a market for them, they come back again in the 1920s. But in Scotland, certain beers don't. So mild ale.
Yeah, for instance, I think you can find things Scotch to penny or Edinburgh ale. So there are also dead styles, I think, right?
Yeah. Well, Tiffany's an interesting one. That's just a weird category. That's
always Texas behind the beer styles, beer history, right?
Yeah. Well, it's particularly complicated because Tiffany was the price of a pint. But it's really deceptive because that was the price of a pint of a Scots pint. And a Scots pint was, I think, twice the size or 4 times the size of an English one. So
that's good.
So it's deceptive if you see pint because it was such a different measure to the Scottish one. It was, not just a little bit different, really, really different in size. So I mean, I've seen loads of rubbish written about Tiffany, which was, a tax category, one that was specifically put in the Act of Union because it was a sort of mid-strength beer and it didn't fit in with the English tax categories, which was you either had table beer or strong beer, beer and ale. And so there was a big difference in the two in terms of strength and how much tax you paid. And the typical Scottish beer, which was Tiffany, sort of came in the middle. So they created a new tax category just for that, which I think might have only been applicable in Scotland. I'm not sure about that. But basically it was just like as a sort of compromise for Scottish brewers. But I've seen so much crap written about what it was. People get. I don't remember what I worked out the strength was. I think probably about 4.5%. I think I worked it out. That's when I looked at the various information about it. But yeah, but I mean that really disappears. I don't remember when they get rid of the tax category, but that doesn't really exist outside the 18th century.
Yeah. But so if the people that are listening to us, if they want a true example of a non-Americanized Scottish ale, it will be very hard to come by, right? Like people are hearing you and hopefully reading your book about Scottish beer. But well, after reading it, you think I would like to try how the beer were similar to the 20s and the 18th century, and the 19th century. Can we have a real taste of Scottish beers, or we're condemned to drink what the American craft revolution think the Scottish beers were?
Some people have brewed ones, brewed some of the old recipes. That's why I publish all this stuff, so I can occasionally get to drink some of these beers. That's why I publish all the recipes. So pretty things they did a Youngers #1 from 1939, which was very interesting. So yeah, I've got to taste some recreations of some of the Scottish beers. They've been a lot of fun.
You've been collaborating with a few well-known brands through trying to recreate a few ancient like beer styles. Some of them almost that have disappeared, right?
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to work on some pretty cool projects. The things with Fuller's were really good. Well, pretty things. They did some brilliant versions of old beers. Fuller's, I worked on some stuff with the Past Masters series. Goose Island, we've done a couple of beers. Jester King, I did a beer with them.
And you have a few projects in your hands in the next few months here.
Yeah,
in the middle of the pandemic.
I got an exciting one, which I can't really say much about, but one of the things I would most like to have got done. So I'm pretty excited about that. So hopefully that's going to happen this year. Yeah, there's always stuff on the go. Yeah, it's good. It's frustrating. I can't travel anywhere.
Yes.
I had to cancel 2 US trips in 2020. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to get to the beer conference they've got planned in Williamsburg in Virginia in October. I'm hoping that's going to go ahead, but who knows?
I organized the national homebrewing contest in Portugal. So this year we were having Charlie Papazian with us just to help us understand a little about beer, of course. But of course he couldn't travel also because of the pandemic. So everything seems like in a way that we can see the lights at the end of the tunnel right now. But hopefully we can recover our projects and start rediscovering beer again. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lucio, do you have any questions or by yourself or any of the people that are here?
No one in the chat have a question yet, okay? And I like your your conversation, okay?
Well, it's fun, you know. I'm happy to chat.
Yeah.
So it's always fun. Yeah, I mean, I hope I've been able to educate people a bit about Scottish beer and about what it's what it was really like. Yeah, I mean, I've sometimes when I've seen descriptions of things like 60 shilling, I realise I'm thinking, okay, you've never actually drunk one of these, have you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but when I read your post in your blog, it's like you're also very humble because you always saying that no, there's so many things that I've still to understand about Scottish beers and beers that other countries that you are researching. So there are still so many things to define about Scottish beers, and we were talking yesterday, no, the day before, sorry, about also Irish beers. That's like also a belief in what Irish beers were, right?
Yeah, well, Irish beers, they're really good fun, actually. I'm really lucky that I've got a little bit of good information on Irish beers. So, right. I've seen some people asking on the internet where would people go to the first places people would want to go when they travel again?
Yeah.
People probably would guess what my ones would be, which would be Glasgow and Cork. Would be the top two. Glasgow, because I still need some stuff from the Scottish Brewing Archive. Cork, because they've got, at least I'm pretty sure, that they've got brewing records from both of the breweries there. So both Murphy's and Beamish and Crawford. So I'd really like to have a look at those.
Yeah, because it's such a beautiful country, and well, not that big country. I was there like 2 years ago, and the idea that people have around the world, that's everything goes around Guinness. Of course, Guinness is very important, and it exists all over the country, and it also it's like Bushmill, Guinness, that means Ireland, really. But when you travel through the country and you go to small villages, and you see the culture, the beer culture they still have, and the beer they produce. Sometimes it's really so different from the Guinness stuff. That's it's strange. Our brand controls all the beer history of that country, but there's many things to find below that.
Yeah. Well, I was really lucky. I was in the Guinness archive.
Yeah.
I got to look at some of the old brewing records, which was really interesting.
In Dublin, right?
Yeah, in Dublin. So,
There will be a book about Irish beers.
I would like to. Well, I have my schedule of books. So currently it's World War II.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm like,
we've talked about that, and
yeah. So
I'm looking forward to read it. Really.
Yes.
So maybe 90% of the way through that.
Yeah, because the guys that are still listening to us, or that will see the streaming later at YouTube. Ron has a beautiful book about beer in the World War One period, and there are many things that well, the war, such a big as the Great War, can disrupt everything. But the techniques and the ingredients and the things that is changed in brewing history is fantastic. So I recommend you to see it's available. For instance, at the link that's Ron put here, www.lul.com.
Yes.
/spotlight Andrews Black, or eventually at Amazon. So it's a great book, as many others from Ron, but I really enjoy this one. So I'm looking forward for the next one for World War II, of course.
Yeah. Well, it's got completely out of hand, actually. It's currently over 900 pages, the manuscript.
We'll have to cut a little bit, right?
Yeah, well, there's some stuff that I'm going to cut out of it, so it's going to be, yeah, I'm going to have to say, but it's I'm up to almost 500 recipes.
Wow.
So it's pretty mad, but yeah, what I wanted to try and do was the recipes themselves tell part of the story. So this is what I wanted to do with the recipe section of the book, was to not just have recipes, but to use the recipes to show what's going on at various periods during the war, and how this is affecting the way people are brewing. And so I think that the recipes fit with the narrative of the book, and yeah, it's just my idea, but it just means that the book's huge.
We'll have to wait a little, so maybe you can come and present it in Portugal when this whole pandemic is over. Lucio, I don't want to monopolize Ron.
No,
I would like to,
of course.
So, if you have any more questions, or we can enhance and thank Ron for his being with us.
Yes,
Okay.
there was very good presentation. I can say I learned a lot of the Scotty beer. Okay, I don't know anything, but this presentation I learned a lot. Okay, very
Okay,
good. That,
well,
that's the
I'm happy if you learned something.
no, yes. That's the objective of this webinar. We learn something or more than we know about one beer or one style, something like that. Okay?
Okay.
Ron, there was a pleasure, a big pleasure, stay with you and Bruno, okay, in this webinar, and I hope you see again here in this little space, okay?
Okay, no, it was fun. I really enjoyed it.
It's fine, okay.
Ron,
Okay.
thanks you again, and it was really a pleasure.
Yeah, okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.